So can you tell me about your experiences of breastfeeding?
I was very keen to breastfeed because I knew of all the health benefits for my daughter as well as the health benefits for me. I've got a very strong family history of breast and ovarian cancer, so I was very keen to breastfeed for that reason as well. So I went into it with quite a positive attitude. And at first, it all seemed to be going very well. The first 24 hours seemed absolutely fine, and I thought, well, this isn't as difficult as everyone makes it sound. But then once we came home and she was a bit more awake and feeding more often, that's when the trouble really started. And I had very, very painful nipples, cracked and bleeding nipples, and it was just agony to breastfeed. And so I'd say the first 6 to 8 weeks really were really quite hard.
Can you tell me what you knew about breastfeeding before you had your baby?
I knew about the health benefits of breastfeeding, so I knew that it was better for the baby's immune system to help her fight infection, that it had all the right blend of nutrients and the right amount of water and all that sort of thing. And I knew that it was good for bonding, and I knew that it was much more convenient and cheaper and easily packaged and portable, and I knew that it was good for mums in that it reduced risks of cancer and osteoporosis and so on. I didn't really appreciate how hard it would be and how much of a skill it was to breastfeed. I'd figured that people are mammals, and mammals have been around for millions of years, and they've all had no problems breastfeeding, so why should I have any problems? I thought it just must be natural, and it must be very easy, and I was very wrong.
Where did you get that information?
I guess it was more of a perception, because the women that I'd seen breastfeeding, or the women I'd seen in cafes or breastfeeding in supermarkets, and they all looked so comfortable and happy, and I thought, well, it can't be that hard really. Not very many people in my family have breastfed. I just haven't been around people of the right age to be breastfeeding, and I think out of my female relatives, a lot of them bottle fed rather than breastfed, so there wasn't much family input, but it was just the women that I'd seen out in public. They seemed to be very happy with it, so I thought it must be easy.
Right. So your mother didn't breastfeed?
I think she tried to breastfeed me. My mother tried to breastfeed me for the first few weeks, but she'd had problems. I think she thought that she didn't have enough milk, and therefore she moved me on to formula very quickly.
What country was that in?
I was born in Sri Lanka, and that's where my mum moved from breastfeeding to bottle feeding.
Just muse with me for a little while about the training you had about lactation as an undergraduate.
I had remarkably little training about breastfeeding when I was training. In fact, I learnt all the physiological mechanisms of breastfeeding, all the hormonal things that went on, and so on, but nothing about even why it was important actually. We probably had like 5 minutes of a lecture saying, oh yes, it's important for mother-child bonding, and it's good nutritional value, etc., etc. But that was probably about it, and certainly nothing about how to breastfeed or how to teach somebody to breastfeed. We were given to understand that it was all very straightforward.
So this training did not prepare you for your breastfeeding experiences?
No, not at all. I don't think it helped at all. In fact, I think it was negatively helpful in that it made me think it was a lot easier than it was, and it just didn't prepare me for it at all.
If you're out, do you miss a feed? A breastfeed?
It depends on where I'm going. I think it took a while for me to get enough confidence to breastfeed in public, so there were times when I would take a bottle of express milk and give her a bottle rather than breastfeed her, and then I would just express when I came home if I was very full. But I've become more confident, and I will feed her in more places now, so I'll feed her in cafes and restaurants, but there are some places where I just don't feel comfortable breastfeeding. Sometimes when I'm out with members of the family, my father-in-law, for example, or my father, I just would not feel comfortable breastfeeding in front of them. I think they would find it quite odd as well. And sort of, workplaces and so on, I prefer to give her a bottle rather than breastfeed her there.
In your own home, would you not feed in front of the male members of your family either?
I think it's more a question of my male members of my family not feeling comfortable watching me rather than me feeling uncomfortable. I mean, my father and my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, for example, have just never grown up around breastfeeding women, so they would find it really odd to be confronted with it, and that would make me uncomfortable. I'm originally from Southeast Asia, and a lot of women do breastfeed there, but it's very much a women's thing, and they would go off to a different part of the house to breastfeed, or the men just wouldn't be around when they were feeding their babies. So I think that's why Asian men sometimes feel uncomfortable seeing a woman breastfeeding. I mean, obviously it's not a problem with my husband, but as I said, with older members of my family, it certainly is. No, as it became more and more painful, I became less and less keen to feed, and it was so much so that I was just putting off feeds for as long as I could, and every time she cried, I thought, oh no, it can't be that she's hungry, it must be something else. Maybe she's wet, or maybe she just wants a cuddle, and she can't possibly want to feed. I really don't want to feed her. And so it sort of extended to about 4 hours, and a couple of times even 5 hours, just because I really was not happy to feed her, just because it was so painful.
What sort of help did you get at that stage? Did you tell somebody that you were experiencing this pain?
I did. I came home from hospital quite quickly, which in retrospect perhaps wasn't a good idea. It had just been very crowded and very busy and noisy, and I didn't really have very much help in the hospital because the midwives were completely overrun that day. They'd been very, very busy on the wards and in delivery suite. So I came home after about 10 hours, and maybe if I'd stayed in hospital for a bit longer, maybe things would have quietened down and there would have been some midwives available to help me in the ward. But I just wanted to get home at that stage. Once I got home, I had my mother-in-law at home with me, and she was very supportive, but unfortunately she hadn't had very much experience with breastfeeding either. She had trouble breastfeeding her baby, and she had forgotten what she had learned, so she was supportive but couldn't actually offer much practical help. The midwives came home to visit me every day for about 2 weeks, and I found them kind of variably helpful. Some of them had obviously had children of their own and knew what to do and sat with me and showed me how to position the baby, but quite a few of them had never had children and knew the theory of it but couldn't actually help practically. And they knew about as much as I did, really, because I think it's very easy to read a book and say, oh, nipple to nose, and make them gape and so on and so forth, but unless you've actually physically done it, I don't think you can teach somebody else to do it. So I found that a bit frustrating, and I thought I didn't really realise what other resources were available to me for help. So I just thought all I had were these midwives, and I'd see a different midwife every day. So I was getting inconsistent advice, and it was all really frustrating and stressful, on top of the tiredness and the soreness and just the stress of having a new baby. So I found those first couple of weeks really awful. At the end of that, I discovered that my local hospital had a breastfeeding clinic, and I went along there, and they were incredibly supportive, very, very experienced, and really helped me get things back on track.
2 questions. What did you do about that inconsistent advice? How did you deal with that in the first couple of weeks when you were seeing a different midwife every day?
It was very hard to deal with so many different opinions from so many different people, and I kind of just decided which ones I thought were the most sensible and went with that, and would try that for maybe 48 hours, and then if that didn't work, take somebody else's advice and go with that. But it was really hard, and those days just seem like a haze now, because there was just so much information being thrown at me, and not all of it was very useful. And I felt like I was a complete failure, actually, because all these women were saying, oh, well, it's all about the latch, it's all about this, it's all about that. And I tried so hard to do everything that they told me to do, and I just couldn't seem to do it. And I found that really upsetting.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about that feeling like a failure?
I guess partly because I thought breastfeeding would be so easy, and because there are all these midwives who meant well, but who are saying, oh, it's fine, you know, it's very easy, you just need to, it's just a skill, and once you get it, it'll be fine. And I thought, well, I'm trying so hard and I can't get this skill, I can't do it. And I guess in my job, I've been so used to applying hard work or perseverance or a bit of research or a bit of common sense in getting something done, that I just found it incredibly frustrating that despite all of this, I couldn't do it. I couldn't breastfeed properly, and it was sore for me, and my baby was getting tired and upset and hungry, and I just felt terrible. I just thought, I'm an awful mother. What am I doing? I can't cope. And it took a while to get over that.
What did it do for your confidence?
It really knocked my confidence to think that I couldn't breastfeed, because I think particularly because I had some friends from my antenatal classes who were having no problems at all breastfeeding, and I thought, well, everyone else is doing it, everyone's doing it aside from me, why can't I do this? And it was hard.
So you fortunately found a clinic at your local hospital. What did they do that turned things around?
I think the positive thing about the breastfeeding clinic was that firstly, there were lots of other mums there who were in exactly the same boat as me. And there were mums who had older babies than I, who, you know, this was, you know, I went there when my baby was 2 weeks old, and there were babies there who were 8 weeks old, and their mums were still having problems breastfeeding. And that made me feel a lot better, thinking, well, clearly I'm not a complete useless mother. It happens that people can't breastfeed. And that was, I think, one of the biggest confidence boosters about the clinic. The second was that the midwives who ran it were incredibly calm and supportive and very sensible, and they listened to what you had to say and just gave small amounts of very sensible advice rather than information overload and trying to tell me too many things at once. They also had lots of visual aids which really helped. There were lots of photographs of how babies latched and where the nipple goes in the baby's mouth, and they had a doll which they would, you know, show me, which they would use themselves to hold, and they would use the doll to pretend to latch onto themselves, and that was quite useful as well. And also you could watch other mums breastfeed up close, and the other mums usually didn't mind, and that was quite nice as well, just so that you had lots of different sort of visual inputs. And because the same two midwives ran the clinic, and the clinic ran twice a week continuously, I had consistent advice. I could go back every week and they would say exactly the same things, and I could see that the things they told me were working, because they could follow up on what I was doing and see how I was progressing each week.
What about health professionals? What would you say to them?
I'd say to health professionals that the most important thing is just to listen, I think, because they seem to have so much advice, but very few of them actually have the insight to just listen and, you know, to hear what your problems are, and to take the time to be supportive and to encourage you, and that's so important, I think. You know, I can only hope that more women have access to breastfeeding support, either from a breastfeeding clinic or from the La Leche League, because I think that's, at the end of the day, what I found the most useful, to have a single, consistent source of advice that I could go to as often as I wanted. I do remember my first breastfeed, and it wasn't entirely pleasant because the labour had been very long. I was very tired and I didn't really know what to do, and I just remember the midwife taking the baby and holding my breast in one hand and the baby in the other hand, and just kind of putting both of them together, and I didn't really know what was going on, and it was just quite a shock to have a baby to hold, really. I wasn't really watching what she was doing or thinking about what she was doing, and it did hurt a little bit, but you know, the midwife said, oh no, that's fine, that's normal, it's because, you know, she's got a small mouth and your nipples are very tender yet, and that'll all sort itself out. So I didn't enjoy that very first breastfeed. Subsequently, it became a bit easier for that first 24 hours. I think, I don't know whether I was doing it correctly or not, but it seemed to be a bit easier at first.
Do you remember how often you put her to the breast in that first 24 hours?
In the first 24 hours, I'd read that you had to put the baby to the breast as often as possible. So I think I was doing it about every 2 to 3 hours. She was quite sleepy the first day, so I don't think I woke her up, but it seemed to be quite often. I think it was about 2 to 3 hours. I think having now 4 months down the line, I think it's been a fantastic experience. I've not enjoyed every minute of it, but on the whole it's been incredibly positive, and I've enjoyed it overall. It's hard to start, and there are times when it seems very hard to keep going. And all I would say would be to get help and to keep going, because at the end of the day you just feel this incredible feeling of satisfaction and achievement at having done it. I think it's important to not feel like a failure when it is going wrong, because every woman's different and every baby's different, and some people will just find it harder than others. And I think it's also important to not listen to some of the kind of, the sort of expectations that you get from other health professionals. I found, for example, my health visitors were very unhelpful. They kept saying, oh, well, you must breastfeed, of course you must breastfeed, and not actually helping me learn to breastfeed, but just making me feel that I ought to be doing it. And at the times when I was finding it quite hard to breastfeed, and when my baby wasn't putting on weight and I was looking for alternatives or just other ways in which I could supplement my breastfeeding, I found them very unhelpful. And they would say things, oh, you mustn't ever give the baby formula, that's just entirely the wrong thing to do. And I think in retrospect, when I did top her up with formula, it was exactly the right thing to do, because I had to top her up so that she continued to gain weight until I could get my breastfeeding back on track. So yeah, be strong, and don't let yourself be cowed by people telling you that there is only breastfeeding and that's the only way to do it, because there are other ways to help breastfeeding, I think, such as expressing milk or giving a bit of formula occasionally, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you just have to find out what works for you and then stick with it and forget about what everybody else says, really. I went to the clinic on and off for about 5 to 6 weeks. What happened was I eventually got the latch right, but I had a couple of other hiccups along the way. One was that I developed mastitis a couple of times, and I suspect that was because I hadn't got the latch quite right. And that was a bit of again, that kind of took my confidence away, because once I thought I'd had my latch right, then something else happened, and I had these horrible, painful, red, sore breasts, and I had to take antibiotics, and I felt dreadful, and I just needed to go back and get a bit more emotional support, I think, if nothing else. But that all sorted itself out. However, I think when she was about 8 weeks old, I noticed that she wasn't really putting on weight quite as well as she ought to have been. She'd dipped down quite badly in those first 2 weeks, which I assume was because I was breastfeeding her so badly, but then she'd started to pick up again, but she never quite followed a centile. She started sort of crossing the centiles, going downwards, and that was very worrying. When I went to the breastfeeding clinic, they were very good about sort of talking me through what exactly I was doing, and sort of routine-wise how many feeds she was getting a day. And at that stage, she was getting about 8 feeds a day, but she still didn't seem to be getting enough milk at each time. So they suggested a sort of variety of strategies to increase my breast milk production. So what I first did was I started expressing at the end of each feed, so that I'd have a bit of extra breast stimulation. So I would feed her, express, and then give her whatever expressed milk I had at the end of each feed, so she was having sort of a double feed, if you like. And I did that for about 2 or 3 weeks, and it was very time consuming and quite draining, because it's bad enough, I think, feeding every 3 hours through the night, but when you also have to be up and expressing, and then giving her the bottle and sterilising the bottles and so on and so forth. It got very tiring. Then what happened was, but that still didn't really seem to be working. And again, I started getting quite upset because I thought, you know, what more can I do? So I started topping her up with formula. I'd breastfeed her and then give her a bottle of formula, and she'd have sort of between, say, 2 and 4 ounces after breastfeed. And at the same time, I started taking some domperidone, which is what the breastfeeding clinic recommended, to increase my breast milk production. Domperidone is actually an anti-nausea drug, but it has the side effect of increasing lactation. So I was taking 1 tablet 3 times a day for about 2 weeks, and it did actually increase my breast milk production, so that I was getting more each time I expressed at the end of a breastfeed, and you know, so then I went back to breastfeeding, expressing, and giving her the express milk. And that seemed to settle her, actually. Once my breast milk production had gone up a bit, her own growth picked up a bit, and she went back onto the centile that she was born on, and has followed that ever since. So that's what I've continued doing. She's down to 6 feeds a day, but I breastfeed her and top her up with express milk at the end of each feed. And it sounds a bit of a bother, but it's worked now for the last 2 months, and she's incredibly settled and is happy with her 6 feeds a day, and she sleeps through the night, and I just don't want to rock the boat. So I think I'm going to just continue doing that until it's time to wean her.
Are you still taking the domperidone?
No, I stopped taking the domperidone after about 2 weeks, but I really did think it had an effect. I noticed it myself. I mean, I could see the effect it was having in the quantity of express milk I was getting.
Any side effects from it?
No, I had no side effects with the domperidone at all. I felt fine.